Hello, and welcome to the Joy of CX. I'm David Cox, and in this episode, I just wanted to take some time before we get into the how of becoming a truly customer-centric organization to talk about the why. Why do organizations elect to follow the customer-centric route? What gets them to that point? Why do they and why should they think about pivoting to a more customer-first strategy? While there are some specific scenarios that make transformation almost inevitable, we talked in the last episode about the transition from a startup acquisition phase to a more mature customer loyalty focus, or scenarios where you have a platform that's well and truly burning, and it's a case of change or it's game over, as was the case of a client I worked with in Brazil that we'll come back to later in the series. But there's a more general scenario, which is also one that's a little bit harder to detect and pinpoint, that I really want to dive into in a bit of depth, because being able to spot it early can save a lot of wasted time and energy. What we're going to do is kind of explore and unpick what leads businesses to get to that point where they decide to put much more focus on the customer, and to try to understand what are the kind of symptoms that businesses should be looking out for. Before we get into that in detail, I think we should probably get the textbook answers out of the way first. All of the books, all of the consultancies will reinforce messages like customer-centric organizations outperform the market, that NPS is a lead indicator of future revenue growth, and so on. All of these things are statistically true. I've worked with a client where we were able to accurately quantify the impact of NPS on revenue and work out that a 1-point improvement of NPS drove an increase of 8.5 million euros of recurring revenue a year. There is strong empirical evidence of the upside of good CX, both in examples like that, but also across all sectors, all markets. There's been lots of research done that proves that companies that look after their customers better generally outperform their competitors. But honestly, I'm not really sure it's worth getting into that research in detail. Put simply, we all intuitively know that happy customers spend more, stay longer, tell their friends, and become your best salespeople. So I suppose the question is, if it's that obvious, why is true customer centricity such a rare phenomenon? I challenge you to come up with maybe 5 companies that you deal with regularly that you would really consider to be paragons of CX virtue. I think there are 2 main reasons. One more obvious and one slightly more subtle one. The first is that equally commonly held belief that treating customers well costs money. This is one of those myths that I hope we'll unpick as we go through the transformation journey. But in essence, it's grounded in the rather simplistic idea that good customer experience simply means pandering and pampering customers, which would indeed mean devoting extra resource. Whereas the real essence of CX is much more about laser focus on delivering what customers really value, nothing more and nothing less. And in reality, this can often drive real efficiencies. The second, more subtle reason is one that every company comes up against and struggles with. And this is the issue of short-termism versus long-term strategy. A customer-centric strategy will always be about building a long-term relationship with the customer and driving sustainable growth by creating a bond of trust and respect. But in the real world, businesses have quarterly targets to hit, annual plans to deliver against. There'll always be a temptation to do things to hit those targets that might go against the longer-term relationship. Be that an unjustified price rise, an acquisition offer that benefits new customers at the expense of existing ones, deliberately choosing a cheaper but lower quality supplier, and so on. All businesses have short-term management cycles that will inevitably lead them to forget their customer-centric principles and take the short-term tactical path, often with very good reason. But it's the accumulation of these decisions that build up over time to the point that the company becomes far more focused on the inside-out view of what's good for the business now, this quarter, rather than the longer-term view of what's good for customers and the longer-term health of the business. Over time, where this leads to is what you might call a kind of corporate midlife crisis. I mentioned in the first episode that very often there are so many equivalencies between our own lives as people and the lives of companies, almost as if they were a person in their own right. If you think about the midlife crisis from a human perspective, and I suppose this is, a particularly male phenomenon, I make no apologies for that, us men being the weaker sex, we tend to be a bit more prone to it. And if we think about what is the root of a midlife crisis from a human perspective, it's very often the situation where, we're in our 20s and 30s, with very strong ideas of what we're going to achieve, we're striving for our goals, we have a clear picture of what success is going to look like, and we strive for that and we put all our energies into it. And then we get to midlife, around the 40s, and we realize we haven't quite achieved what we set out to achieve. We haven't really hit the mark. We veered a little off course and we're kind of going through the motions of life. We've got our families, we've got our kids, but we're not quite where we wanted to be. And we start to realize that we're never going to be. We haven't quite hit the target, and we're confronted with that gap, with that kind of hole inside. And that's where we fall into the midlife crisis. And we'll talk about some of the symptoms of that in a second. But I think the same is absolutely true with organizations. When a startup hits the market, the founders have magnificent ambitions that they're going to take over the world. They're going to become the dominant player. They're going to wipe the competition out. They're going to reshape the market. All of these wonderful things. And then as the company grows and matures, you see some of those ambitions starting to fall away a little bit. They start losing touch with their original principles and ambitions and start to fall into the slightly easier, short-term tactical decision-making mode. They get to the point where, just like people, they're kind of going through the motions, doing annual budgeting cycles, focusing on meeting quarterly targets, trying to chip away at the cost base, trying to do the same but with 10% less every year. And it becomes very, very routine. You're no longer really thinking about what you're there to do. It all becomes a bit samey, a bit continuistic, a bit of the repetitive hamster wheel. And there's that sense in the organization of getting stuck, grafting away, possibly starting to lose a bit of market share, putting the squeeze on costs, and soldiering on year to year. And when we're in this kind of midlife crisis, we can often spot it from the symptoms. And this applies both at the human level and also at the corporate level. So what are the kind of classic cliched symptoms of a person going through a midlife crisis? You're going out buying a sports car, you're dressing younger, you suddenly start hitting the gym, sometimes unfortunately having an affair, or you take up the guitar. All of these sorts of things are classic signs of a person going through this. And exactly the same is true at the corporate level. Rather than buying a sports car or having an affair, we see companies suddenly going on M&A sprees and using acquisition to try and bolster their faltering sense of value. Rather than dressing younger, companies suddenly decide to pretend they're startups all over again. And suddenly there's footballing tables and beanbags appearing all over the office. Or maybe they try to reimagine themselves as a digital company, and it all becomes about agile manifestos and digital solutions without really knowing what the problem was they were trying to fix in the first place. Instead of going to the gym, maybe they get into really aggressive cost cutting, trying to hone their bloated organization and recapture their younger, leaner selves. So there are all these kind of telltale signs that a person or an organization is in the throes of a midlife crisis, and they're doing things to try and stave it off without really getting anywhere. You tried the overly tight jeans or the funky new office space, but now it's time to look a bit deeper. At the personal level, this often leads us to trying a bit of counseling, therapy, coaching. You start to re-examine yourself rather than trying to pretend to be something else. You actually try to think about what you're going through and where you're trying to get to. And I think the same thing is happening at a corporate level. That's when companies often bring in the heavyweight strat consultancies. That's when you bring in the McKinseys and the like to help you plot that course back to vitality. And that can often be the sort of trigger point that enables us, either as a human being or a company, to really start to transition through midlife into a new perspective, a new way of looking at your life or your business. And what we find almost always, both at the human level and also at the company level, is that this is about finding real meaning and connection. It's about finally gaining some clarity on why we exist and how we connect with others in our world. I probably should have started this episode with some kind of trigger warning about overly indulgent philosophizing, but this is really where we get into the crux of why this podcast is called The Joy of CX in the first place. I genuinely believe that one of the greatest joys of being human is to feel connected to purpose and sharing that connection with people that matter most to us. And the same is true for companies. There's joy to be found in really reconnecting with customers. So as we work our way through our corporate midlife crisis, without necessarily being aware of it, we're actually embarking on our CX transformation journey. By fully re-examining why we exist for our customers, how we connect with them to deliver something of true value to them, we start to think about our business from the outside in. And this is the start of a whole new phase of maturity. And this new stage has at its center a sense of connection that re-energizes the business, a connection with customers and what matters to them, a connection with your employees who start to engage with that renewed sense of purpose, a direct line of connection between customers and employees driven by a recognition that they're on the same side rather than being on opposing teams. And this can actually reignite the commercial results that the organization can achieve. By starting with what matters to customers and working from there, we can get to the point where customers are actually happy to give you their money. We're no longer trying to control them and manipulate them so they begrudgingly feel they have to give us their money. We get to the point, to use Apple as an obvious example, maybe back in the glory days at least, where customers would actually sleep out overnight just for the privilege of being the first to give over their hard-earned cash. And in the case of Apple, quite a lot of it. So embarking on a CX transformation journey is the route to reigniting the spirit of the business, re-energizing the employees, and ultimately creating positive connection with customers. So many thanks for listening, and hopefully I'll see you soon. I promise we're done with the philosophizing, and we'll start to get into more of the practical how-to of the journey by laying the foundations of what embarking on the road to customer centricity actually means.